Imagine standing in the center of a crowded ballroom, the music stopping, and 300 eyes burning into you. The man you loved, the man you were supposed to marry in a week, isn't holding your hand. He's holding someone else's. Lady Taylor Beauchamp didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply turned and walked away into the freezing London rain, believing her life was effectively over. But she didn't know that watching from the shadows was the most powerful man in England. And as she stepped onto the wet pavement, the rumble of wheels wasn't a cab taking her to shame. It was a royal carriage coming to change history. This is the story of the broken engagement that shocked the Victorian world. You won't believe who was inside that carriage. The chandeliers of the Ponsonby residence in Mayfair were bright enough to expose every flaw in a diamond, and certainly bright enough to expose the fraying hem of Lady Taylor Beauchamp's silk gown. It was a dress she had turned 3 times, dyeing it a darker shade of emerald each season to hide its age. Tonight, however, no amount of tailoring could hide the truth that hung over her family like a shroud. The Earl of Wotton, her father, was destitute. Taylor stood near the heavy velvet curtains, clutching a glass of warm punch, her eyes scanning the room for Lord Frederick Ponsonby. Freddy, her fiancé. They had been engaged for 6 months. It was a match that had surprised society. The Ponsonbys were wealthy, new money built on railways and steel, desperate for the prestige of an old title. Taylor's family had the title, an earldom dating back to the Tudors, but not a penny to rub together. It was a transaction disguised as a romance, though Taylor, with her naive heart of 22, had convinced herself that Freddy's shy smiles meant love. "Have you seen him?" Taylor turned to see her Aunt Agatha, a woman who wore her corset so tight it appeared to restrict blood flow to her charitable impulses. "Not yet, Aunt," Taylor whispered. "He is likely with his father in the library." "Well, find him," Agatha hissed behind her fan. "The rumors are swirling, Taylor. They say Beatrice Hyam has been seen at the Ponsonby estate 3 times this week. 3 times, and she does not visit for the tea." Taylor felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Beatrice Hyam, the daughter of an American industrialist. She was loud, she was vibrant, and she possessed a dowry that could buy a small country. Just then, the orchestra's waltz faltered. The heavy double doors at the top of the grand staircase swung open. The room hushed. Freddy appeared, but he did not look like the dashing groom-to-be. He looked pale, sweating, his cravat slightly askew. And he was not alone. On his right arm hung Beatrice Hyam, resplendent in a gown of crushed ruby velvet that likely cost more than Taylor's family estate. On his left stood his mother, Lady Ponsonby, looking like a general surveying a battlefield she had already won. Taylor stepped forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. She caught Freddy's eye. "Look at me," she begged silently. "Tell me this isn't what it looks like." Freddy looked at her, then immediately looked down at his polished boots. Lady Ponsonby cleared her throat. The sound echoed in the cavernous hall. "If I could have everyone's attention," she announced, her voice shrill but commanding. "We have a delightful announcement to make regarding my son, Frederick." Taylor froze. The glass in her hand trembled. An announcement? But we are already engaged. "It is with great joy," Lady Ponsonby continued, her eyes sliding over Taylor with the indifference of a butcher discarding a bone, "that we announce the betrothal of Lord Frederick Ponsonby to Miss Beatrice Hyam." The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was violent. It sucked the air out of the room. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by the sharp snap of fans opening to hide whispering mouths. Taylor didn't move. She couldn't. It felt as though the floor had dissolved. She looked at Freddy. "Freddy," she whispered. The word was too quiet to reach him. but he saw her lips move. Finally, he looked up. His eyes were wet, terrified. He mouthed, "I'm sorry." Then Beatrice leaned in, whispering something in his ear and laughing, a light, tinkling sound that shattered Taylor's world completely. The humiliation was absolute, a public repudiation. In the Victorian marriage market, Taylor was now damaged goods, jilted, discarded for a richer model in front of the entirety of the ton. Aunt Agatha let out a strangled sob of rage beside her, but Taylor felt a strange, icy calm descend. She set her glass down on a nearby table with a precise click. "Taylor, you must faint," Aunt Agatha hissed. "Swoon. Make a scene. Make him look the villain." "No," Taylor said, her voice steady, though her hands were ice. "I will not give them the satisfaction of seeing me fall." She straightened her spine. She lifted her chin. And then, Lady Taylor Beauchamp did the unthinkable. She walked directly toward the staircase. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, faces twisted in a mixture of pity and gleeful voyeurism. She walked past the Duke of Leinster, past the gossiping matrons, past the snickering debutantes. She reached the bottom of the stairs and looked up at Freddy and Beatrice. For 1 second, she held Freddy's gaze. She didn't scream, she didn't curse. She simply nodded, a regal acknowledgement of his cowardice. Then she turned her back on him. The walk to the exit felt like miles. Every click of her heels on the marble floor was a testament to her survival. She could hear the whispers starting. Poor thing. Ruined. What will the Earl do now? She pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the night. The London fog had turned into a biting, freezing drizzle. The air smelled of coal smoke and wet horsehair. Taylor stood on the steps of the Ponsonby mansion, shivering. She had no cloak. She had left it in the cloakroom and refused to go back in to retrieve it. She couldn't bear to face the footman who had undoubtedly heard the announcement. "Carriage for Lady Taylor," the doorman called out, but his voice was hesitant. "There is no carriage," Taylor said quietly. Her family's carriage had been sold 2 months ago to pay the butcher. She had arrived in a hired hackney cab, and she didn't have the fare to call another one. She began to walk. Her satin shoes were soaked through within seconds. The cold seeped into her bones, matching the numbness in her heart. "What do I do now?" she thought, the panic finally beginning to crack through her composure. Papa was counting on the settlement. He has debts with men who do not accept apologies. We will lose Wotton Hall. We will be on the street. She turned the corner onto Grosvenor Square, the sounds of the party fading behind her. The street was dark, lit only by the flickering gas lamps that cast long, distorting shadows on the wet pavement. She felt a tear finally escape, hot and stinging against her cold cheek. Then another. She leaned against the iron railing of a park, gasping for air. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest. She was 22, penniless, and publicly humiliated. She heard the rhythm of hooves behind her. Clip-clop, clip-clop. It wasn't the frantic pace of a hansom cab. It was the heavy, rhythmic thunder of matched thoroughbreds, the sound of power. Taylor wiped her face hastily and kept walking, keeping her head down. She didn't want to be seen. But the horses slowed. The carriage pulled alongside her, blocking the gaslight. It was an immense vehicle, lacquered in black so deep it looked like a void. The crest on the door was understated, painted in silver. But anyone who knew society knew that crest. It depicted a rampant lion holding a key. The Stirling family, the Duchy of Kensing. Taylor stopped. The Kensing line was ancient, wealthier than the Queen, and notoriously private. The current Duke, Arthur Stirling, was a man of 30 who rarely attended balls. He was known as the Wolf of Westminster, for his ruthless efficiency in the House of Lords and his cold demeanour. The carriage door opened before the footman could even jump down. "Get in." The voice was low, baritone, and commanded instant obedience. Taylor hesitated, water dripping from her nose. "Your Grace, you are ruining a pair of very expensive silk shoes, Lady Taylor, and you are shivering. Get in before you catch your death." It was a command, not a request. Taylor looked up and down the empty street. She had no options. Swallowing her pride, she grasped the handle and climbed into the warmth of the carriage. The interior was upholstered in soft cream leather and smelled of cedarwood and faint tobacco. Sitting in the corner, shrouded in shadow, was Arthur Sterling. He was a striking man, though not in the pretty, boyish way Freddy was. Arthur had sharp angles, a strong jaw, a high forehead, and eyes of a piercing, stormy grey that seemed to see right through her wet dress to the terrified soul beneath. He was dressed in severe black evening wear. He didn't smile. He simply reached across and handed her a heavy wool blanket. "Dry yourself," he said. Then he knocked on the roof of the carriage. "Drive." The carriage lurched forward. "Where are you taking me?" Taylor asked, her teeth chattering as she pulled the blanket around her shoulders. "Not home," Arthur said. He leaned forward into the light. "Because if you go home now, your father will ask you why you are alone, and you will have to tell him you have failed. You are not ready for that conversation yet." Taylor stared at him. "You were there? At the ball?" "I am always where I need to be," Arthur replied enigmatically. "I saw what Ponsonby did. It was efficient. Brutal, but efficient." "He is a coward," Taylor spat, surprised by her own venom. "He is a boy," Arthur corrected, "controlled by his mother and his wallet, a dangerous combination." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "But you were interesting. You didn't cry. You didn't scream. You walked away with the posture of a queen going to the gallows." "I have my pride, Your Grace. It is the only thing I have left." "Is it?" Arthur sat back, crossing his long legs. "Pride doesn't pay the debts on Wotton Hall, Lady Taylor. Pride doesn't stop the foreclosure notices I know your father received this morning." Taylor went cold. How do you know that?" "I own the bank that holds the mortgage," Arthur said simply. Taylor felt the air leave her lungs. "Are you going to evict us? Is that why you picked me up? To tell me personally?" "No." Arthur paused, watching the rain streak against the window. "I picked you up because I have a problem, Lady Taylor. And coincidentally, you have a problem. My problem is that my grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, is dying. She refuses to pass quietly until she sees me married. She threatens to cut off the entailment to my charitable foundations, schools, hospitals, unless I produce a wife by Christmas." He turned his gaze back to her. "I do not want a wife. I do not want love. I despise the frippery and the deceit of romance, as demonstrated so ably by your Mr. Ponsonby tonight. I want a partner, someone with impeccable lineage, who knows the rules of society, who possesses a spine of steel, and who is currently desperate." Taylor's breath hitched. She knew where this was going, but she couldn't believe it. "I am offering you a job, Lady Taylor," Arthur said, his voice void of emotion. "Marry me. I will pay off your father's debts entirely. Your family will be secure. You will have the title of Duchess, the highest rank in the land below the Queen herself. You will have an allowance of £5,000 a year. And in return," Taylor whispered, "in return, you run my house, you host my dinners, you charm the diplomats I cannot stand. You pretend to be the devoted wife in public. And in private, we leave each other alone. The carriage hit a bump, swaying slightly. Taylor looked at the man opposite her. He was offering her the world. He was offering her revenge. Imagine Freddy's face when she returned, not as a spinster, but as a duchess. But it was cold. It was a business deal. "Why me?" she asked. Arthur looked at her, and for a second, the grey eyes softened, just a fraction. "Because, Lady Taylor, I saw you walk through fire tonight, and you didn't burn. That is the kind of woman I need beside me." He extended a hand. It was large, gloved in white kidskin. "We are arriving at my townhouse. If you stay in the carriage, I will have the driver take you home to your father and his debts. If you take my hand, we begin the greatest deception London has ever seen." Taylor looked at his hand. She looked at the rain outside. She thought of Freddy's pitying look. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out and placed her cold hand in his. "I accept," she whispered. Arthur's fingers closed around hers. "Good. Then dry your eyes, Your Grace. We have a wedding to plan." The news of the engagement between the Duke of Kensington and Lady Taylor Beauchamp did not just ripple through London. It struck like a thunderclap. The morning papers were hysterical. "The Iron Duke to wed," screamed the headlines. "Poverty to power." For Taylor, the last 72 hours had been a blur of terrifying efficiency. She had not returned to her father's crumbling estate. Instead, Arthur had installed her in a suite at the Savoy Hotel, chaperoned by his formidable grandmother, the Dowager Duchess Henrietta. Henrietta was 80, sat in a wheelchair, and had a tongue sharper than a guillotine. "Stand up straight, girl," Henrietta barked, poking Taylor's shin with her cane. "You are to be a duchess, not a dairymaid. Chin up. Arthur tells me you have spirit. Show me." Taylor straightened, suppressing a wince. She was standing on a podium in the center of the suite's parlor, while 3 seamstresses pinned layers of Chantilly lace around her. "I am trying, Your Grace," Taylor said. "Don't try." "Be," Henrietta snapped, though her eyes twinkled with a strange sort of approval. "My grandson is a difficult man, Taylor. He is cold. He is buried in his politics and his secrets. But he picked you. Arthur never does anything without a reason. You must be special." "Special?" Taylor thought. "I am simply a convenient solution to a mortgage problem." Just then, the door opened. Arthur walked in. He stopped, staring at Taylor. She was wearing the prototype of her wedding gown, a cascade of ivory silk and pearls. For a moment, the Duke's stoic mask slipped. He looked, struck. "Arthur!" the Dowager barked. "Stop gawking. You look like a fish." Arthur cleared his throat, regaining his composure instantly. "Grandmother, Lady Taylor, I trust the preparations are suitable?" "They are adequate," Taylor said, testing her new role. She stepped down from the podium, the silk rustling like a whisper. "But I have a request, Your Grace." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "The engagement party, the one you have scheduled for tomorrow night at Kensington House." "Yes?" "I want the Ponsonbys invited." The room went silent. The seamstresses stopped pinning. The Dowager Duchess let out a dry cackle of delight. Arthur studied Taylor. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. The first real smile she had seen. It made him look devastatingly handsome. "You wish to rub their noses in it?" Arthur asked. "No," Taylor said, smoothing her gloves. "I wish to show them that I am indifferent. Indifference is the cruelest revenge, is it not?" Arthur nodded slowly. "I chose well. They shall be invited. And Taylor?" "Yes?" "Wear the diamonds, all of them." The night of the ball, Kensing House, was a palace. There was no other word for it. The ballroom was twice the size of the Ponsonbys, lined with gold leaf and mirrors that stretched to the ceiling. When the footman announced, "The Duke of Kensing and his betrothed, Lady Taylor Beauchamp," the room did not just go quiet, it froze. Taylor descended the grand staircase on Arthur's arm. She was no longer the girl in the dyed green dress. She was draped in the Kensing sapphires, a necklace of heavy, dark blue stones that glittered under the lights. Her dress was silver, cutting a silhouette of absolute perfection. She looked out at the sea of faces. She saw the shock, she saw the envy, and then she saw them. Freddy Ponsonby stood near the buffet, a glass of wine halfway to his mouth, looking as if he had seen a ghost. Beside him, Beatrice Hyam looked furious, her face flushed a blotchy red, her own expensive jewellery looking suddenly gaudy compared to Taylor's historic gems. Arthur leaned down, his breath warm against her ear. "Steady. You are the highest-ranking woman in this room. They are ants." Taylor smiled. It was a genuine smile. "I am ready." They reached the floor. Immediately the crowd swarmed, desperate for a word, a nod, an acknowledgement from the new power couple. "Taylor!" The voice was desperate. Taylor turned. Freddy was pushing through the crowd, ignoring Beatrice's hand, clutching his arm. He stopped before her, breathless. "Taylor, is it true? You and the Duke?" Arthur stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Taylor, a human shield of broad shoulders and icy intimidation. "Lord Ponsonby," Arthur said, his voice dropping the temperature of the room by 10 degrees. "You will address her as Your Grace or Lady Taylor. You have lost the privilege of familiarity." Freddy flinched. I only meant Taylor, please. Can we speak? Alone?" Beatrice arrived at his side, seething. "Freddy, leave her alone. She's just managed to entrap a bigger fish, that's all." Taylor looked at Beatrice. She saw the insecurity in the other woman's eyes. "Miss Hyam," Taylor said softly, "I do hope you enjoy the Ponsonby estate. I hear the roof in the east wing leaks terribly. You might want to use some of your substantial resources to fix it." A titter of laughter ran through the nearby crowd. Beatrice gasped. Taylor turned to Freddy. She looked at his weak chin, his fearful eyes. She realized suddenly that she didn't hate him. She pitied him. He was a boy. Beside him, Arthur felt like a mountain. "I have nothing to say to you, Lord Ponsonby," Taylor said, "except thank you." Freddy blinked. "Thank you?" "Yes. If you hadn't broken my heart on Tuesday, I wouldn't be owning London on Friday." She turned to Arthur. "Dance with me, Arthur?" "It would be my pleasure," Arthur said. As they swept onto the dance floor for the waltz, Arthur pulled her close. His hand was firm on her waist. "You were magnificent," he murmured. "I felt terrified," she confessed. "Good. Fear keeps you sharp." He spun her around, the world blurring into a mix of gold and light. But as the music swelled, Taylor noticed something. A man standing on the balcony above, watching them. He wasn't dressed for the ball. He wore a rough coat and a flat cap. He was staring directly at Arthur with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "Arthur," Taylor whispered. "Who is that man on the balcony?" Arthur looked up. His body went rigid as stone. The color drained from his face, leaving him deathly pale. "Ignore him," Arthur commanded, his voice tight. "But he looks—" "I said ignore him," Arthur snapped. It was the first time he had raised his voice at her. The man on the balcony slowly drew a finger across his throat, then vanished into the shadows. Arthur pulled Taylor closer, his grip bruising. "Smile, Taylor," he hissed. "Smile for the cameras. Smile for the wolves. But know this, our arrangement just became much more dangerous. Taylor smiled, but her heart hammered against her ribs. She had entered a world of wealth and power, yes, but she had also stepped into a world of shadows, and she had a feeling that the broken engagement was the least of her troubles. The wedding had been the event of the decade. The Archbishop of Canterbury had presided. The Queen had sent a diamond brooch, and the streets were lined with thousands of cheering commoners. Taylor had said, "I do," without a tremor in her voice. But now the confetti had been swept away. The guests had gone home, and the reality of her bargain had set in. They were at Kensington Park, Arthur's ancestral seat in the wilds of Derbyshire. It was a massive, brooding structure of grey stone, surrounded by ancient forests that seemed to swallow the light. It had been 2 weeks, and Taylor had barely seen her husband. Arthur spent his days in the West Wing, locked in his study with secretaries and men who arrived in unmarked carriages at odd hours. He emerged only for dinner, where they sat at opposite ends of a 30-foot mahogany table, making polite conversation about the weather or the tenant farmers. It was a cage, a very expensive, velvet-lined cage. One rainy afternoon, Taylor decided she had had enough. She was the Duchess of Kensington, not a prisoner. She dismissed her maid and walked down the long, draughty portrait gallery toward the West Wing. "Your Grace," a footman stammered, stepping in front of the double oak doors. "The Duke gave strict orders. He is not to be disturbed." Taylor smoothed the skirt of her heavy wool walking dress. "I am his wife, distinct from the rest of the world. Move aside." The footman hesitated, torn between fear of the Duke and the steely gaze of the Duchess. Taylor didn't wait. She pushed past him and threw open the doors. The room inside was filled with cigar smoke and the smell of old paper. Arthur was standing by a massive map of London, pinned to the wall, surrounded by 3 men. They all stopped and stared as Taylor entered. "Out!" Arthur commanded the men, his eyes locked on Taylor. The men scrambled to gather their papers and fled, leaving the husband and wife alone. "I gave an order," Arthur said, his voice low and dangerous. "And I ignored it," Taylor replied, walking further into the room. She looked at the map on the wall. It was covered in red pins. "You are avoiding me, Arthur. You brought me here, isolated me from my family, and now you treat me like a piece of furniture you regret purchasing. I will not tolerate it." Arthur sighed, rubbing his temples. He looked exhausted. The stoic mask was slipping. "I am not avoiding you because I dislike you, Taylor. I am avoiding you to keep you safe." "Safe from what?" Taylor gestured to the map. "From red pins?" "From the truth." Arthur walked over to his desk and picked up a piece of paper. He hesitated, then handed it to her. "Read this." Taylor took the paper. It was a crude note, letters cut from newspapers and pasted together. "The wolf takes a mate. The mate will bleed for the sins of the father." Taylor felt a chill run down her spine. "Who sent this?" "We call them the Libertines," Arthur said, leaning against the desk. "A radical anarchist group. My father, he was a hard man. He evicted hundreds of families from our lands in Ireland and the North during the famine years to make way for sheep. He prioritized profit over human life. He died in his bed, safe and rich. But the children of the people he ruined, they haven't forgotten." He looked at Taylor, his grey eyes haunted. "The man on the balcony at the ball, his name is Sean O'Malley. His father hanged himself after my father took his farm. Sean doesn't just want me dead, Taylor. He wants to destroy everything I claim as mine. And now, That includes you." Taylor lowered the letter. The luxury, the jewels, the title. It all suddenly felt very fragile. "Why didn't you tell me before the wedding?" she whispered. "Because you wouldn't have married me," Arthur said bluntly. "And I needed you. I needed the facade of a happy marriage to distract the public while I hunt them down. I am using you as bait, Taylor. I am sorry." It was a brutal admission. Taylor stared at him. She should be furious. She should be terrified. But strangely, she felt a surge of adrenaline. She had spent her life being passive, waiting for Freddy to propose, waiting for her father to lose their money. Now, she was in the center of a storm. She walked over to the map. Where was this note posted? From a post office in the village of Hathersage, 5 miles from here, Arthur said, surprised by her reaction. "Then they are close," Taylor said. She turned to him. "You say I am bait, Arthur? Fine. Then let's make sure the trap is set properly." Arthur stared at her. "What are you proposing?" "The Boxing Day hunt," Taylor said. "It is in 3 days. The entire county will be there. If O'Malley wants to make a statement, he won't do it while we are hiding in this fortress. He will do it when we are out in the open." "Absolutely not," Arthur snapped. "It is too dangerous. You will stay inside." Taylor stepped closer to him. She reached out and took his hand, the first time she had touched him voluntarily since the wedding. His skin was warm, his pulse steady but strong. "You married a partner, Arthur, not a porcelain doll. If we hide, we look weak. If we ride out, head high, we draw them out." She looked deep into his eyes. "Trust me." Arthur looked at their joined hands, then back at her face. The tension in the room shifted. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was attraction. The shared danger was a heady drug. "You are infinite trouble, Lady Taylor," he murmured, but he didn't let go of her hand. "Very well. We ride." The morning of the hunt was crisp and cold, the ground hard with frost. The lawn in front of Kensington Park was a sea of red coats, baying hounds, and steaming horses. The local gentry had turned out in force, eager to see the new Duchess. Among them, to Taylor's surprise, was a familiar face. Lord Frederick Ponsonby sat atop a nervous chestnut mare near the edge of the crowd. He looked thinner, his eyes darting around nervously. Beatrice Hyam was nowhere to be seen. Taylor, mounted on a magnificent black stallion named Obsidian, trotted over to him. She wore a riding habit of midnight blue velvet, a top hat with a veil, and she looked every inch the aristocracy. "Lord Ponsonby," she said coolly, "I did not expect to see you here. Is your wife not with you?" Freddy jumped as if she had struck him. "Taylor, Your Grace." "No. Beatrice is indisposed. She remained in London." He lowered his voice, leaning in. "Taylor, you shouldn't be here." Taylor frowned. "Excuse me?" "You need to go back inside," Freddy whispered, sweat beading on his upper lip despite the cold. "It's not safe. The woods. Please, just go back." Before Taylor could press him, the Master of Hounds blew the horn. The sound pierced the air, and the hunt began. The field of riders surged forward, a thundering wave of horseflesh and adrenaline. Taylor was swept up in the gallop. She was an expert rider, having grown up in the saddle, but today she rode with a purpose. She kept close to Arthur, who was riding a massive grey hunter at the front of the pack. They cleared the first fence, then the second. The wind whipped Taylor's face, exhilarating and biting. They thundered across the open fields and into the dense tree line of Blackwood Forest. As they entered the trees, the light dimmed. The path narrowed. The pack of riders began to string out. "Stay close!" Arthur shouted back at her. But suddenly, a horn blew from a different direction. Not the Master's horn. A discordant, sharp sound. The hounds became confused, scattering to the left. The main body of the hunt followed the dogs. Arthur pulled his horse up. That wasn't the signal. "Arthur!" Taylor shouted. From the undergrowth, 3 men emerged. They weren't wearing the red coats of the hunt. They were dressed in rough wool, scarves pulled up over their faces, and they were holding rifles. "Get down!" Arthur roared. He launched himself from his horse, tackling Taylor just as a gunshot cracked through the air. They hit the frozen ground hard, rolling into a ditch filled with dead leaves. Obsidian, Taylor's horse, reared and bolted. "Are you hurt?" Arthur hissed, covering her body with his. "No," Taylor gasped, her heart hammering against his chest. "Stay here." Arthur reached into his boot and pulled out a Webley revolver. He was armed. Of course he was armed. He popped up, firing 2 shots. One of the attackers cried out and fell. The other 2 scrambled behind trees, returning fire. Bullets chipped the bark of the oak tree above their heads. "We are pinned down," Arthur growled. "Where is the rest of the hunt?" They followed the hounds, Taylor realized. The false horn, it lured them away. "Arthur Sterling!" a voice shouted from the trees. It was a rough, Irish accent. "Come out, you devil! Come out and pay for the dead!" "O'Malley," Arthur whispered. Suddenly, the sound of hooves approached from the path behind them. "Help!" Taylor screamed, hoping it was the gamekeeper. A horse skidded to a halt. It was Freddy Ponsonby. "Freddy!" Taylor cried, scrambling up. "Thank God! Do you have a weapon?" Freddy looked down at them. He was holding a pistol, but he wasn't pointing it at the attackers. He was pointing it at Taylor. Arthur froze, his own gun half raised. "Ponsonby," he said, his voice deadly calm. "Put it down." "I can't," Freddy sobbed, tears streaming down his face. "They have Beatrice. They said they'd kill her. They said I just had to lead you to the clearing." "You traitorous coward," Arthur snarled. "I'm sorry, Taylor," Freddy whimpered. "I'm so sorry." "Freddy, look at me." Taylor stepped out from behind Arthur, ignoring Arthur's shout of protest. She stood tall, facing her ex-fiancé. "You broke my heart once to save your fortune. Now you are going to kill me to save your wife. Is there no depth to your weakness?" Freddy's hand shook violently. "They made me." "No one makes you do anything, Freddy," Taylor said, her voice hard as steel. "You choose. Put the gun down." "Don't listen to the witch," O'Malley shouted from the trees. "Shoot the Duke, Ponsonby, or your wife dies tonight." Freddy squeezed his eyes shut. He tightened his finger on the trigger. Bang! The gunshot echoed through the forest, silencing the birds. Taylor flinched, waiting for the pain. But she didn't fall. It was Freddy who fell. He toppled from his saddle, a bloom of red spreading on his shoulder. Arthur had fired. He hadn't hesitated. He had shot the man who was threatening his wife. "Run!" Arthur grabbed Taylor's hand. They sprinted into the dense brush as O'Malley and the remaining attacker opened fire again. Branches whipped Taylor's face, tearing her veil. Her lungs burned. They reached an old stone gamekeeper's hut, deep in the woods. Arthur kicked the door open, shoved Taylor inside, and barred it behind them. He slumped against the door, sliding down to the floor. "Arthur?" Taylor knelt beside him. "I'm fine," he gritted out. But when he moved his hand from his side, his white glove was soaked in blood. "You're shot," Taylor gasped. "Just a graze," Arthur lied, his face pale. "Taylor, listen to me. Ponsonby, he said they have his wife. This isn't just revenge. This is a coordinated attack. They knew the route. They knew the signals." He looked at her, his eyes losing focus. "We are alone out here, and night is coming." Taylor looked at the blood seeping through his coat. She looked at the flimsy wooden door. Outside, she could hear the snap of twigs as O'Malley's men closed in. The Duke of Kensing, the most powerful man in England, was bleeding out on a dirty floor, and Taylor Beauchamp, the girl who had been too afraid to make a scene at a ball, was the only thing standing between him and death. She looked around the hut. There was a rusty fireplace poker, a lantern, and a bottle of high-proof spirits on a shelf. Taylor grabbed the poker. She tore a strip from her petticoat to bind Arthur's wound. "Rest, Arthur," she whispered, kissing his cold forehead. "You saved me in the rain. Now I save you." She stood up, gripping the iron bar. The girl who walked away silently was gone. The Duchess was ready for war. The sun had vanished behind the Blackwood Hills, plunging the forest into an abyssal darkness. Inside the gamekeeper's hut, the air was freezing, smelling of damp rot and the copper tang of blood. Arthur was fading. The bullet had caught him in the side, just above the hip. He was conscious, but his skin was clammy, and his breathing was shallow. "Leave me, Taylor," he rasped, his hand gripping her wrist with surprising strength. "There is a loose board at the back window. You are small enough to squeeze through. If you run now, you can make the main road before they realize you are gone." Taylor was tearing the hem of her petticoat into strips, soaking them in the high-proof whiskey she had found on the shelf. She didn't look up. "I am not going anywhere, Arthur." "Don't be a fool," he hissed, pain etching lines around his mouth. "They want me. If you stay, they will kill you to get to me." Taylor stopped. She turned to him, her face smudged with soot, her hair wild. In the dim light of the single lantern, she looked like a vengeful spirit. "I walked away once, Arthur," she said, her voice trembling not with fear, but with fury. "I walked away from the ballroom. I walked away from my dignity. I will not walk away from my husband." She stood up. She had found a box of lucifer matches and 3 old glass bottles. She was making fire bombs. Outside, the crunch of boots on frost broke the silence. "Come out, Duchess," O'Malley's voice drifted through the wooden slats. "We know you're in there. We saw the smoke. Send the Duke out and we might let you live." Taylor moved to the door. She peered through a crack. There were 3 of them now, O'Malley and 2 others. They had torches. They were preparing to burn the hut down. "Arthur," Taylor whispered, "can you shoot?" Arthur struggled to a sitting position, leveling his Webley revolver at the door. His hand wavered, then steadied. "I have 2 rounds left." "Make them count," Taylor said. She picked up the lantern and the bottle of spirits. "I'm going to open the door." "Taylor, no! Trust me." Taylor kicked the wooden bar away and threw the door open. The sudden movement startled the men outside. For a split second, they hesitated. In that second, Taylor didn't scream or beg. She hurled the open bottle of whiskey directly at the man holding the torch. The liquid splashed over his coat and the torch flame. Whoosh! The man ignited like a Roman candle. He screamed, dropping the torch and flailing backward, colliding with O'Malley. "Now, Arthur!" Taylor dropped to the floor. Bang! Bang! Arthur fired from the darkness of the hut. 1 shot went wide, but the second caught the 3rd attacker in the leg. He went down, cursing. But O'Malley had recovered. He shoved his burning comrade into the snow and charged the hut, a hunting knife glinting in his hand. He was massive, fueled by years of hatred. He crashed through the doorway, kicking the lantern aside. The hut plunged into semi-darkness, lit only by the dying embers in the grate. Arthur tried to raise the gun, but the hammer clicked on an empty chamber. O'Malley roared and lunged for the Duke. "No!" Taylor screamed. She didn't think. She didn't plan. She grabbed the heavy iron fire poker she had placed in the coals. It wasn't red hot, but it was solid iron. As O'Malley raised the knife to plunge it into Arthur's chest, Taylor swung the poker with every ounce of strength in her body. It connected with a sickening crack against the side of O'Malley's knee. The big man howled, his leg buckling. He fell sideways, the knife skittering across the floor. He scrambled to grab it, but Taylor was faster. She kicked the knife away, then stood over him, the poker raised high. "Stay down!" she shrieked, a primal sound that she didn't recognize as her own voice. O'Malley looked up at her, eyes wide with shock. He saw the girl in the velvet riding habit, the useless aristocrat, looking ready to crack his skull open. You witch!" he spat. He lunged for her ankle. Suddenly, a thunderous sound filled the small hut. Not a gunshot, a horn. Ta-ta-ta-ta! The hunting horn. And this time, it was close. "Here! We are here!" Taylor screamed, turning toward the open door. Hooves thundered outside. Voices shouted, "Surround the hut! Don't let them escape!" It was the gamekeepers. And leading them, bloody but still mounted on a borrowed horse, was the master of the hunt. O'Malley realized the game was up. He scrambled toward the back window, limping heavily. But before he could reach it, 3 hounds burst through the door, snarling. The siege was over. Taylor dropped the poker. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably. She turned to the corner where Arthur sat. He was slumped against the wall, his eyes half closed. But he was watching her. And in his gaze, there was something that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just respect. It was awe. "Remind me," Arthur whispered, a faint smile touching his pale lips. "Never to make you angry, Taylor." Taylor fell to her knees beside him, tears finally spilling over, washing away the soot on her cheeks. "Hold on, Arthur. The carriage is coming." The winter that followed the attack in Blackwood Forest was the longest Derbyshire had seen in a generation. But inside the grey stone walls of Kensington Park, a different kind of thaw had begun. For 3 weeks, the Duke of Kensington, the man known to Parliament as the Wolf of Westminster and to his enemies as a cold-blooded tyrant, was confined to his bed. The infection from the bullet wound had brought a fever that terrified the household staff, but it had not terrified Taylor. She had dismissed the nurses who tiptoed around him, terrified of his temper. She took charge of the sick room herself. She was the one who changed the dressings on his side, her hand steady as she washed the angry red flesh. She was the one who spooned broth into his mouth when he was too weak to lift his head. One night, in the grip of fever, Arthur had grabbed her hand, his grey eyes wide and unseeing. "Don't let them take you," he had muttered, thrashing against the sheets. "I won't let them take you." Taylor had smoothed the hair back from his damp forehead. "I am here, Arthur. I am not going anywhere." When the fever finally broke, the dynamic of the house had shifted irrevocably. The servants no longer looked to the steward for orders. They looked to her grace. She managed the tenant disputes, she answered the correspondence from London, and she organized the security that now patrolled the perimeter of the estate like a private army. When Arthur finally descended the grand staircase for the first time since the attack, leaning heavily on a cane, he found Taylor in the library, reviewing the estate ledgers. He watched her for a long moment. "You have moved the surplus grain to the southern silos," he noted, his voice rough from disuse. Taylor didn't jump. She finished her entry in the ledger and looked up. "The northern silos are prone to damp. We would have lost 20% of the harvest. I moved it." Arthur limped into the room and sat in the leather wingback chair opposite her. He looked at the woman he had bought to be a figurehead. "My steward has been trying to convince me to move that grain for 10 years. I never listened." "Men rarely listen to good advice when they are busy being powerful," Taylor said with a faint smile. Arthur laughed, a rusty, genuine sound. "I suppose I am not as powerful as I thought. It seems I am now merely the husband of the Duchess. The recovery was private, but the retribution was public. The trial of Sean O'Malley and Lord Frederick Ponsonby was the theatrical event of the season. The gallery of the Old Bailey was packed so tight that ladies fainted from the heat and the smell of unwashed bodies. Everyone wanted to see the traitor aristocrat. Taylor sat in the private gallery, veiled in black lace, Arthur beside her. He held her hand openly, a breach of Victorian decorum that sent whispers rippling through the court. Freddy Ponsonby stood in the dock. He looked nothing like the golden boy of the ballroom. His suit was ill-fitting, his hair thinning, his face gaunt with terror. Beatrice Hyam had abandoned him the moment the handcuffs were placed on his wrists, fleeing to Paris to avoid the scandal. Freddy was alone. When the prosecutor detailed how Freddy had led the Duke into an ambush to clear his gambling debts, the court gasped. It was a betrayal so base, so cowardly, that even the hardened judge looked disgusted. "Lord Ponsonby," the judge intoned, peering over his spectacles, "you have disgraced your lineage, your class, and your manhood. You traded a human life for a wager. The mercy of the crown is the only reason you do not face the hangman." Freddy wept. He actually wept, his shoulders shaking. He looked up at the gallery, searching for Taylor. His eyes begged for pity. "Please," he seemed to mouth. "Help me." Taylor looked at the man she had once thought she would die for. She remembered the rain on the pavement outside the Ponsonby ball. She remembered the humiliation. And she felt nothing. No hate, no triumph, just a profound indifference. She was a mountain. He was dust. She turned her head away, breaking the gaze. "I sentence you to transportation for the term of 20 years. The judge slammed his gavel. "Take him down." As Freddy was dragged screaming from the dock, Arthur squeezed Taylor's hand. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Taylor said, lifting her veil. "I am ready to go home now." Buckingham Palace, June 1890. The golden finale. By the time the Queen's Jubilee Ball arrived in June, the legend of the Iron Duchess had fully solidified. The story of the poker, the firebombs, and the rescue had been exaggerated in the penny dreadfuls until Taylor was depicted as a warrior queen akin to Boadicea. The carriage ride to the palace was silent. Arthur was nervous. He adjusted his white tie, checking his pocket watch for the third time. "You are fidgeting, Arthur," Taylor said, smoothing the skirt of her gown. It was a masterpiece of gold silk, embroidered with real gold thread that caught the gaslight. Around her neck sat the Kensing sapphires, but on her head was the Kensing tiara, a towering construct of diamonds that was heavy enough to give a lesser woman a headache. Taylor wore it as if it were made of feathers. "I have faced anarchist gunmen and hostile parliaments," Arthur muttered, "but tonight feels different." "It is just a ball, Arthur." "No," he said, looking at her intensely. "It is the start of the rest of our lives." When the doors to the grand ballroom opened, the herald's voice boomed, "The Duke and Duchess of Kensing!" The silence was instant. 600 heads turned. They walked in. Arthur walked with a slight limp, leaning on an ebony cane with a silver handle. But he did not look weak. He looked dangerous, a predator who had survived a trap. And on his arm was Taylor. She walked with her chin high, her eyes scanning the room. She saw the women who had laughed at her green dress months ago. She saw the men who had placed bets on her father's bankruptcy. They dipped into curtsies. They bowed low. It was a wave of submission. Taylor Beauchamp had been a pauper. Taylor Sterling was a power. They danced the first waltz. Arthur held her close, disregarding the space required by propriety. They are terrified of you, Arthur whispered in her ear as he spun her past the royal box. Good, Taylor replied. Fear is much more reliable than charity. You have become hard, my dear. I learned from the best, she countered. When the music faded, Arthur led her not to the supper room, but out onto the terrace. The night air was sweet with the scent of jasmine. Below them, the fountains of the palace gardens shimmered. Arthur moved to the stone railing, gripping it with his white-gloved hands. He took a deep breath. Taylor, do you remember the terms of our agreement? In the carriage? Taylor felt a sudden tightness in her chest. I do. You wanted a hostess. I wanted security. We agreed to live separate lives. Yes, Arthur said. He turned to face her. The moonlight washed out the grey in his eyes, making them look silver. I lied. You lied? I told you I didn't want love. I told you I despised romance. Arthur stepped closer, the cane clicking softly on the stone. I said those things because I didn't think I was capable of feeling them. I thought my heart had calcified years ago. He reached out, taking her hand. His thumb brushed the faint, white scar on her palm, the burn from the fire poker. But then I watched you walk away from Ponsonby with your head high. I watched you ride into a trap to save my reputation. And I watched you stand over me in a freezing hut, ready to kill to keep me alive. Arthur dropped his cane. It clattered to the floor, forgotten. He took her face in both his hands. The contract is void, Taylor. I do not want a business partner. I do not want a convenient wife to manage my silos and charm the diplomats. I want you. I want the fire and the anger and the silence. I love you. I have loved you since the rain. Taylor looked up at him. She saw the vulnerability he hid from the world. The Wolf of Westminster was begging. Tears pricked her eyes, not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming relief. The armor she had built around herself since that terrible night at the Ponsonby ball finally cracked. I thought I was just an investment, she whispered. A way to save the entailment. You are my salvation, Arthur corrected her. Renegotiate with me, Taylor. What are your terms? Taylor smiled, wrapping her arms around his neck, pulling him down to her level. Total surrender, Your Grace, she whispered. No more secrets. No more separate wings. And you must promise me one thing. Anything. Never let me wear these shoes again. They are killing my feet. Arthur let out a bark of laughter, and then he kissed her. It was a kiss that seared, deep and possessive, erasing the memory of every cold night and every lonely moment. Above them, the first fireworks of the Jubilee exploded, red, gold, and green cascading over the London skyline. The crowd inside the ballroom cheered for the Queen, but on the balcony, Arthur and Taylor held only each other. The carriage had come for her in the rain, offering a way out. But standing in the gold light of the fireworks, Taylor knew she hadn't just escaped. She had arrived. And that, my friends, is the story of the Duchess of Iron. It's a reminder that sometimes the person who breaks you is doing you a favor, because they are clearing the way for the person who will build you up. Freddy Ponsonby died in exile, forgotten by history. But Arthur and Taylor? Their letters to each other are still preserved in the British Museum, a testament to a love that started with a business deal and ended in a legend. If you loved this story, please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the algorithm show this to more people. Subscribe if you haven't already, and comment below. Do you think Taylor should have visited Freddy in prison, or was her silence the ultimate revenge? I read every comment. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next real-life romance drama.